There are mics, two mics here. Please come up to the mics and just say who you are and then address your question to Susan. So the floor is open, and I'd invite anyone to come along and ask the first question. If not, then I'll ask mine. Okay. Speaking as someone looking at China from India, we've had a number of episodes on the border at critical moments. Once when the Chinese Prime Minister came visiting on his very first visit. Just before that, there was quite a serious incident at the border. And then just before Xi Jinping came for his maiden visit, we had almost an exact replay of that episode. And one of the things we were asking ourselves in India, in the strategic community, was trying to unpack those episodes, and the timing of it was whether, in fact, despite the talk of consolidation, Xi Jinping wasn't quite in charge. And these were signs that he wasn't quite in charge, that the PLA in particular was running its own game, and it wasn't a very nice game if you were sitting in New Delhi. So I wonder, I mean, that's a very particular episode just relating to India, but maybe you could say something a bit more about how you estimate the relationship with this very important actor. I mean, I know one view is that he's shifted people around there, he's very much in charge, and he's got his men at the top of the PLA increasingly. There's another view that perhaps it's not all quite so hunky-dory, particularly as a function of the corruption moves, which have hurt the PLA as well. Right. So maybe I'll just throw that one out to you first.
I mean, that's about as hard a question as you could possibly ask, because I think we really, I mean, I've heard the same rumors. There's a version of the rumor where he's got several of the key factions in the PLA, but not one of the other ones. But I just think it's so incredibly difficult to verify any of this. I mean, it's basically impossible. There was this announcement last week that there's going to be this massive reform of the structure of the People's Liberation Army. My understanding of that is that it has, and maybe there are other people in the room who know more about it, but that it has sort of two goals. One is to balance the Army, Navy, and Air Force parts of the military better, because it's really the Army has kind of run everything, and as you guys are aware, it's maritime and Air Force are going to be potentially much more important in the coming years as China becomes more of a global power, and obviously you need the Navy and the Air Force are very tightly connected. So I think that's one piece. The other piece that I have heard people say is that the current structure of the PLA, which has this is really getting technical, but the general logistics department, the general office, and the general political department is quite siloed. And I guess that the idea is that there's some effort to break up those silos so that it can be more efficiently managed. I mean, certainly, and so I think, certainly his announcement that there's going to be this major reform, that to me seems to suggest that he does have some control. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to do something that major. I mean, this is a major reform. I think the number of high-ranking military officials that have gone down in the corruption campaign, that could be a sign that he's trying to settle scores or get people out of the way, but it could also be a sign that he's to some extent able to do what he wants. But it's such a hard question to answer.
A bit unfair for the lead question, but just to get us started. Yes, please do come up to the mic, and I have another one for you later, but it's a more sociological question. Okay, good. So I'll keep that for later. Yeah.
Hi there. Thanks very much, Susan. Really interesting. Particularly enjoyed your comments about Xi's sort of man of the people image. We've actually recently hosted him in the UK for a state visit. I've got some friends who work at number 10 Downing Street, and they were telling me that the most important thing on that visit for him was that he would go to a pub with the Prime Minister and have fish and chips and a pint of beer. That was 1A on the agenda. Nothing else.
Can you say who you are, by the way, just so everyone.
Yeah, my name's Theo Leonard. I work for Barclays in the UK.
Yeah.
But I just wondered if you could say something a little bit, whether or not you have any observations around the existence of bubbles, financial and economic bubbles in China. We've obviously seen some sort of stock market ramifications this year. There's a lot written around housing bubbles and a kind of a property market bubble. I just wondered if you had any observations around that.
It's not a subject that I know a huge amount about. I definitely think, there are, generally speaking, really profound questions about what exactly is going on with the economy right now that seem to be quite pervasive, even among people that look at the economy, as scholars with a high degree of intensity. I mean, certainly when I, just anecdotally, yes, it seemed like there was a huge oversupply of built housing during the period that I was in China. But what exactly that will mean over the next couple of years, I can't tell you. Sorry.
All right.
My name is Liu Zhen. I'm from the NUS. I'm a PhD student here. And my question is, we can observe the changes, the tightening of the media and NGOs, and also the control on the army. Actually, it happens when the Chinese economy actually is slowing down. And we know that it's the Chinese economy who is getting Communist Party still in power in China for quite a long time. So do you think actually the government is preparing for something, like preparing for the crisis following by the economy slow down? So that's why they are getting tighter on the NGO, media, and army.
Yeah, I think that's possibly one explanation, is that a huge part of the legitimacy of the party has rested on the growth of the economy over the past couple of decades, really. It's a performance legitimacy-based system, right? There isn't a lot of procedural legitimacy, and so if the economy does continue to slow down, if people don't feel like their children's lives are going to be better than their lives, I think that's probably a factor that makes the regime anxious. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because I think the growth of the economy has also given rise, and just sort of the massive changes in China over the last, I'm going to say 10 years, maybe it's longer than 10 years, have also given rise to these sort of new expectations and new aspirations, which I think can be somewhat separated from what's going on with the economy. And I guess I see this tightening up as emanating partially from a concern about those things as well.
All right. Go ahead.
Good evening. Good evening, Ms. Susan. My name is Justin, and I'm happen to be a graduate from Curtin University. My own question is actually regarding about one of the lectures that had been held last year in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, in which China is considered an unprovocative power. But because from this particular lecture, I was actually told, and that's according to a translation, that China is considered to be inward seeking. Do I take it to mean that could this particular inward seeking means that China is by any chance only looking only to its own interests, or possibly even to the point of subordinating the interests of other nations to its own interests?
So did you say inward looking?
Yeah.
Inward seeking.
Yeah.
Inward seeking.
Yeah. I mean, I think essentially the question is whether China is, really very much set on seeking its own interests, or is there a more cosmopolitan, responsible stakeholder kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that. I'm going to again not answer. I think that's a key question, and there are certainly a lot of other stakeholders that have a large stake in China's becoming more of a stakeholder. But I think China's foreign policy thus far seems to be driven primarily by two things. One is sort of pragmatic interests, geostrategic, economic, And then the other one, which is maybe kind of on the upswing, is this kind of this strain that seems to have more to do with nationalism, with revival of the glory of the nation, with sort of staking a claim and saying, we're here, we're big, we're bad, what are you going to do about it? So I think the interesting question is to try to distinguish between when they're acting on the sort of practical impulses and when the activity is being driven more by this other stuff that's about kind of projecting this image of invincibility, strength, bravado, however you want to characterize it.
Okay.
My name is Tomo Kikuchi from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I think your message about China was very nuanced, but largely you didn't really give a positive, I think, picture of the development in the last few years. On contrast, this year, China had a lot of diplomatic victories, including launching of the AIIB and now China's RMB inclusion into the SDR. I think these are interesting contrasts. Do you see any relationship between the two, or how do the people in China perceive these diplomatic victories? Thank you.
Oh, that's a really good question. Also a very good point. I think that I think generally speaking, there is a kind of popular sentiment that is that embraces China's growing capability to kind of be a heavyweight actor in the world. I don't know exactly to what extent people are really focused on the mechanics of the AIIB or on the currency victory, but I think it's sort of, I think there is this idea that those are symbolically important, that that's a sign that the country is maturing, and I think some people really do care about that. Maybe some of the people that I was talking about who are less satisfied are the ones who are maybe a little bit more skeptical of the true importance of those victories. But I think there is still a large group of people, maybe even larger, who are anxious to see China being more assertive, more successful, and more able to sort of, having more capacity to realize its interests abroad. I think there is support for that. And I think they have had some real victories. So.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Ng Chi Siang, and I'm a freshman at Yale and US College. I kind of have two questions to ask. The first is with regards to the lens in which to study how China is actually seen. In your speech, you mentioned two sorts of lens of doing so, firstly being the long-term static one, and the second being the newsflash version. I would just like to clarify what is your own personal lens of which you actually study China with. The second question is regards to China's desire to become a greater power in the international sphere. Assuming that China does not want to be an insular-looking power, but instead perhaps wants to have regional clout that seeks to parallel that of the United States, do you think that it will eventually have to come out in order to be able to achieve this aim rather than pursue solely its own national interests? Thank you.
Sorry, will have to come up? Is that what you said?
I mean, what I mean by that is whether China will eventually have to take a greater role in international affairs, somewhat similar to what the US is doing now, rather than pursue solely its own national interests on the international stage. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to add one last point to the last question, which I just thought about, which was that, I think one way in which your question is connected to what I was talking about is that even though China has had these victories, there is still this kind of brittleness. It's like they haven't yet translated into kind of true, what I would think of, what would look more like true confidence, which would be being a little bit more relaxed about legitimacy, about its relations with the rest of the world. So it is a strange paradox, right, that there are these successes happening and yet they don't seem to be translating into a kind of just greater degree of ease in relations with the rest of the world. Although maybe some people would argue in some sense they are. In terms of how I look at China, yeah, I mean, I was suggesting that both of those kind of ways of looking at Chinese time are flawed. So how do I do it? I think it varies depending on what kind of question you're asking. But I think even in the context of, I think the unit I think of is the story, in a journalistic story. I think in a place that is changing so quickly, it's important to actually have multiple reference points time-wise, so that you can try to capture, not be mindful of the huge changes that have happened over a longer period of time, and yet be attentive to the kind of dynamics that are in the much more recent past. But I think it's always, the reason I was talking about it is I think it's really always a big challenge, and it's one that the media doesn't always get right. Oh, and on this question of if China becomes more of a regional leader, will it have to take on more responsibilities in the mode of the U.S.? Yeah, I think so. I think that will probably that's something that might naturally happen if China assumes a greater role in kind of regulating the region. Yeah.
Well, let me ask another one,
Yeah.
my more sociological one, which I suppose relates a bit more to what you were saying. I think you made the point that there's been this rise of sort of post-materialist values, the environment, my ambitions, my dreams, and finding oneself as a human being and so on. In some sense, you might say that that's kind of an urban and more elitist kind of aspiration or set of values. And yet, of course, the urban environments are growing very rapidly, and most Chinese are there now. But still, I guess a lot of support necessarily must come from the countryside as well. So do you think, in a way, we've got a transitional moment here where the two sectors, as it were, are almost balanced, and and the party has to kind of play both sides of it, and he's still drawing, presumably, quite a bit of support from the countryside, where people are more conservative, who still perhaps see enough change that they buy into a fairly predictable set of policies and values and so on. And more of the tumult and changes in the urban centers, or have I got it backwards? Is it the other way? But
I guess I don't see those two spheres as being so mutually exclusive anymore. If you think about how much fluidity there is, it's almost, I can't imagine, or I have almost never been to a town in the last 15 or 20 years where a substantial part of a rural village, where a substantial portion of the population wasn't out in the cities working and then coming back. So I don't think, you have an age difference, right? You go to lots of villages where the only people that are left are the old people, people with handicaps, and little children who are being left with their grandparents. But I don't think that there is, I just don't think that rural-urban divide is really meaningful in terms of people's aspirations. And certainly this girl I was talking about, she's just one example, but is she rural, is she urban? She goes back and forth. Is she different than her parents? Yes, but I think that also, that has to do with education, age, time in which they came of age. So I think it's fair to argue that it's a national phenomenon. Yeah. It's not just restricted to the cities.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Hello, I'm Roman Skortsos. I'm a master's student here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. And a lot of people always say when they don't understand something from China, China is complicated. And when you came first to China, I'm sure you felt the same. But with your 20 years of China experience now, what are your biggest question marks still? What you say, okay, I will maybe never understand that?
Yeah, I think it doesn't actually. I think you wind up with more questions the more time you spend in China. I actually find that people who've been in China for like a week are often very sure that they completely understand how things are happening. And my experience is that the people that I know that have been studying China, and this sounds like a cliche, but it's really true. The people who have been studying China the longest have the greatest number of questions. Particularly about predicting, what's going to happen next, because they've usually been through a few cycles of making predictions and then having them not turn out to be true. And so I think it's really quite humbling. So what are the biggest questions now? I mean, I think one really interesting one is what's going to happen to these 200 million people that were in this wave of migrants. I mean, they're in a few different sort of sub-generations, but what's going to happen as they come of age? What are their children's lives going to be like? How quickly is the social services network going to sort of catch up to support them? What's going to happen with this aging population? Huge question. What's China going to look like if the economy continues to slow? And what is that going to do in terms of political issues? I mean, that could, it seems like it could affect so many different realms of life. And then I have this, just personally, I was really shocked at, I mean, maybe somebody said my lecture sounded kind of negative. I really, on this trip, and again, it was a short trip, but 10 years ago, I felt quite, this sort of always buoying sense of hope, even when sort of certain kinds of bad things were happening. And on my trip this last time, I just felt a lot less of that than I had in the past. And maybe that was an aberration, but I think there is not still this kind of boundless optimism that there was a few years ago, and maybe the country is just maturing and can live without that. But I was sort of curious to see. And it's so, I mean, you can't really talk about a national mood. That's really an illusion. But at least among this small group of people that I'm in contact with, it'll be interesting to see how that progresses for them.
Okay, got a gentleman here. I know, Chen Kan, would you like to ask a question?
My name is Roberto Tassinari. I'm a private citizen, and I've been living in Singapore for 27 years. I notice, especially from the part of the journalists, as you define yourself, a very strong reluctance whenever you talk about economic figures about China. I follow Bloomberg, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, because of my job, and I never assist a commentary from a journalist on economic figures of any kind. Even from analysts from some of the biggest banks in China, in Singapore, we understand the economic figures are at the least not precise. But nobody dares to comment. You also seem to try to avoid questions on economics today. So I understand there may be a self-censorship from foreign media to comment on that. First of all, how do you feel the real economy is progressing in China? And second, how much self-censorship are you exercising? Maybe there's someone from the Chinese embassy here listening to you.
No,
I think she's a historian, maybe that's
I think that I'm really flattered actually that you think that I have this secret information about the Chinese economy that I'm not sharing. But the answer is no. I'm not an economist. I was never a business or economics journalist, and I don't feel like I am qualified to say anything terribly intelligent about the economy. I do know that that colleagues and friends, people that write for China File that I work with, who do look at the economy, do feel, and I feel like they do say this publicly, that there is a high degree of ambiguity to economic statistics in China, and that it is difficult to get a sense for what's going on. I hear that regularly, but I do feel like that's pretty widely reported, at least in what I read. But I'm really, I am a consumer of economic news on China, but not a producer of it. So no self-censorship on that.
Other question? Chen Kan, you want to ask something? Yeah. As an economist, but you may not want to ask an economics question.
Hi, Susan. I think it's Chen Kan from the Lee Kuan Yew School. It's much clearer now, after listening to your lecture now, than the lunch we had on your views about China. But my question is that it seems that outside China, a lot of people are very optimistic about China. But inside China, more people are pessimistic. And does your finding from this trip to China coincide with other colleagues in America? And do all these observations in recent years actually start to change some people's mind about what China really is happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a wide spectrum of opinion, at least, I mean, I know the US the best. Yeah, again, it depends on how you define optimism and pessimism and what's good and what's bad. But I think, I mean, I'm certainly not the only person who has noticed some of these changes in the kind of civil society sphere. I think that those are pretty well documented and appreciated, and I think in some ways they've caused certain people to recalibrate their ideas about what's possible. You know, I do think there's a cohort of people that were maybe not the most nuanced thinkers to begin with, who had this expectation that free markets were going to politically liberalize China, but a lot of people never really thought that to begin with. So I don't think, yeah, I don't know how significant that group is to the extent that they feel that they've been disabused of their ideas. But no, I mean, I think there are a lot of really good scholars and good journalists who are, you know, reporting on China with great nuance. I think one difference, actually, I will say is, I think, you know, it's still the case that most, and this is not true of scholars as much, but for the press corps, the journalists really are focused on the cities. The majority of their reporting is on sort of high economics and high politics. And I do, you know, have a group of friends who are terrific writers who have made a real conscious decision to focus instead on individual ordinary people and to really kind of eschew reporting on the state. And they actually do wind up with a kind of a different picture. They tend to feel that the arm of the state doesn't actually reach that far into individual people's lives, and I think probably they're getting a different picture than, you know, I am from talking to journalists and academics in Beijing. I think for them the state is pretty close by. I think that may be quite a bit less true if you're a sort of young rural migrant who's become an entrepreneur in a small second-tier city. You know, I think you may have a quite different picture. So some of it, there is, I think there is a need for more reporting that kind of bridges this divide from people who are really focused on ordinary people and have this sort of sociological approach, people who are focused on the state.
Okay, we've got, I'll make this the final two questions, the gentleman there and then yourself. Maybe if you could take both together.
Sure,
we'll
I can take both together.
I'm Donald White from the NUS alumni. Just one question. With regard to, say, to doctrine, how communist is the Communist Party of China today?
Okay. Crisp and
can answer that one pretty quickly.
Hello, my name is William Saredin. I work in the private sector in the resources industry. Just wondering, what are your views in terms of what's Xi Jinping's priority in his leadership? Is it the preservation of the party, the preservation of the environmental and anti-corruption policies, or the economic preservation?
Okay, I think those can sort of go together. So first, I don't think that there's a lot of communist ideology left in the Chinese Communist Party. I think there's I think the little sort of Leninist streak has sort of held on, but no, I mean, you know, you look at China's social services, the government social services, you look at the something I didn't talk about, the incredible and widening wealth gap. You know, I think the party is concerned about these things and the things that the other question mentioned insofar as they affect its ability to preserve its hold on power. And I do think that power is the kind of the name of the game. It's the ideology, and it is the thing that is the kind of goal behind all of these other policies, how to keep the party in power. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me just say on behalf of the school that we very much appreciated your coming. I know you have a busy schedule, and for your great candor and sensitiveness in dealing with the interpretation of China today. And really, it's quite a challenge for anyone inside or outside China to do. And thanks for sharing your puzzlement as much as you can.